A third round of peace talks are set to take place tomorrow between the Ukrainians and the Russians. But as for any sort of deliveratives out of that, it's unclear what's going to happen. Back to you.
Hey, Trey, you're on the ground. You're clearly speaking to Ukrainians. One of the fascinating things about a threat from the outside, whatever it may be, is it creates a sense of unification inside. I'm curious, is that the way it is on the ground today? In any country, there are factions. There are people that disagree. There are people looking for opportunities. I'm just curious what the sentiment is. I don't know if the word is politically, Trey, but the sentiment is among Ukrainians. Is it wholly unified? Are there factions with varying goals jockeying within Ukraine right now?
Broadly speaking, you make a great point. When you look at the people of Ukraine right now, they are extremely unified because they understand that there is one force that's the enemy right now, and it's the Russians. And it's part of the reason we've seen people from across the political aisle here in Kyiv come together with the same goal, and that's to push back this Russian offensive. So we've actually seen people getting along that you wouldn't normally expect in this country because they are preparing for the days ahead. And that means anything from taking the civilian population that can fight and preparing them for battle, and then helping the vulnerable civilians that have to get out of the way, the women and children, to get to the train station, to get to the western part of this country, and ultimately to get to safety. And so that's really what we've seen is the Ukrainian people rallying behind their leaders, the leaders rallying behind their people, and really this holistic approach to doing everything they can to push back this Russian invasion. Back
Trey,
to you.
Really quick. So you say that the goal is to push back this Russian offensive. You also mentioned that there's possibilities maybe tomorrow of some sort of negotiation beginning. Based on what you're feeling on the ground, do the people want a negotiated settlement, or do they just want to crush this invasion, this Russian invasion that came into their country?
Well, look, the possibility of peace in the coming days is very low. It's a reality on the ground that everyone is facing. And part of that has to do with the fact that there is no consensus on what peace would look like. The Ukrainians are not going to simply accept Russian forces in their country. They want their sovereign borders respected, and that's a hard line for them. The Russians say they want the Ukrainians to recognize an area of land called Crimea in the south that they annexed back in 2014, and they also want Ukraine to give up all of their weapons. That's not going to happen. So you have a true stalemate taking place right now in negotiations, and both sides have goals that just simply are not realistic for the current state of play on the ground. But the bottom line is Russia invaded Ukraine. The sovereignty of Ukraine is not being respected by Russia. And so when the international community looks at this in terms of support and weapons and where they're going to flow the aid to, it's going to be Ukraine.
Yeah.
Trey Yingst. Thank you very much, Trey. Appreciate it.
Trey.
Thank you.
There have also been a lot of videos and reports. We saw the video of the Russian helicopters being shot down by, I don't know if it was a Stinger missile. It was likely a variant of that from Poland. But there are reports of upwards of 10 Russian aircraft being shot down over the last 24 hours.
I've heard that.
And again, these are all reports. But when you consider the flow of weapons that could be going in, when you think about a Stinger missile or a Javelin missile is a fire and forget missile, meaning you don't have to keep it aimed at the target after you fire it. It's lethal up to 2.5 miles away.
Wow.
And so the person firing it is never seen, and you can reload multiple into the delivery system, and what it does is it doesn't shoot straight. It shoots straight and then goes up, and then comes down on the top part of tanks, because the top of a tank is what's most vulnerable on a tank. It's a really sophisticated piece of weaponry, and hundreds of them are flowing in. So one man with one weapon system can take out an entire Russian column or a tank.
So what happened to that column? Because I've heard that it stalled. That now I just saw some reports that people said that the Russians who were in this column of tanks, deserted, or they ran out of fuel. What has happened with that? Do we know?
We know. I mean, there are a lot of conflicting reports on that.
Yeah,
there's a lot of videos emerging on the internet of tanks being towed away by tractors that are either out of gas or incapacitated.
And I'm always hesitant before we go all in on what we see on social media. But Pete, I appreciate what you just described for us, because we throw terms around, and I don't know that any of us, outside of someone like yourself who's served in a combat zone fully understands the differences in these types of weapons, a Stinger versus a Javelin. So I take from your description, a Javelin is a surface-to-surface missile system, a Stinger, a surface-to-air missile system. And are both of them sophisticated in terms of the manpower or operating knowledge to use, or can a civilian pick up one of these and use them effectively?
You got to have some training, no doubt. But it's not as if it's weeks and weeks of training. You know, a good day of training on how to load and how to operate with someone else. Or it's just like our special forces. They'll come in alongside groups, train alongside them, give them capability how to maintain those weapon systems. And then you know, more or less average people with a little bit of training can operate them. But with the limited amount of those weapon systems there, likely at those points, they're in the hands of the Ukrainian military trained to use them, or in the hands of select numbers of special forces, which the Ukrainians have, forward positioned against, you know, the main axes of advance. It's just a game changer as far as leveling at least the tactical environment. You can't account for the air superiority of the bombings of the Russians, who have that ability to project that power. But when you're trying to move on the ground, man, an advance can be stopped quickly. And the psychological effect of a Russian tank operator or an APC operator that says some guy 2 miles away from me could have a target on me right now, and my ability to see it is more or less nothing. Yeah. It's incredible. So
let's zoom out. Let's zoom out, and you take us over to.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about the maps. And some of what we're talking about with the columns, guys, is up north, and that invasion on Kiev has stalled, as we've talked about. So let's go down south. We're in the southern part of the country here. We've talked a lot, obviously, about the Crimean Peninsula. The offensive coming out of Crimea has been effective, in large part in Mariupol, because it's also been met with Russian troops heading from the east who moved into the Donbass when this started as well. That was the separatist area. Mariupol is the one where we're talking about evacuations, and we will get to that in a moment more. We've got a sense of what the evacuation route would actually look like. But they've seen 2 to 3 days of relentless bombing. There's no water. There's no heat. You know, food supplies. That's why a talk of an evacuation is important. The other push is toward what is the second nuclear power plant, in I can't even pronounce it, Zaporizhia. And that'll be relevant when we go to the next slide as well, because that's a contested area as well, and a lot of civilians may be heading in that direction quickly. We talked about Kherson. Kherson has been controlled by the Russians, although not necessarily held per their strategy. And you see this red corridor here, Will. It's kind of like what you and Joey talked about last hour. Ultimately, they're not trying to hold all the ground around it. They're making a push. This is a port city. It doesn't look like a port city, but there's an inlet here. And actually, the one remaining ship in the Ukrainian Navy was just scuttled there, sunk, because they believe the Russians will soon take it, and they don't want the Russians to have it. So there's a lot of preparatory actions being taken as well. Let's move to that evacuation route, which we talked about. And the reason I emphasize Zaporizhia, if I'm pronouncing it right, is this is the route along which civilians in Mariupol, controlled by Russians, would move through a humanitarian corridor to leave. How far is this? 226 kilometers, 140 miles. If you look at it on a Google Maps, that's about a 3.5-hour drive. You're not getting anywhere in 3.5 hours in Ukraine today. Apparently, this ceasefire is set for 9 hours. So if you're traveling along this route, you're going to see a traffic jam, no doubt. You're also not heading to a place that's necessarily safe. This is where the contested other nuclear site is. So once they get there, where do they go next, and how effective is that evacuation ultimately? Considering the fact, also, guys, the Russians didn't honor the first one. So what are the chances they honor this one?
It makes me curious what the traffic might actually be like along that route. I'm curious how many Ukrainians, Mariupol residents, are taking up the offer of a humanitarian corridor. As poorly as the last one went, heading into an area that might not necessarily be safe anyway, how many Ukrainians are taking up the offer of a humanitarian corridor?
It's a very interesting question. And you're looking at, there are, a couple different routes. You don't have to necessarily move in this direction, one of which goes straight through Russian territory, so they're probably not doing that. What faith do you have in the honoring of that obligation by the Russians? It remains to be seen. You do make yourself more vulnerable in that process. I'll also mention Odessa is the ultimate prize down here in the south. That would lead to the complete consolidation of blocking off of the Black Sea for all the reasons we've talked about as well. So there's been limited advances on the map, especially in the north and east. There's also been conversation that there's a strategic pause amongst the Russians for 24 to 48 hours. They're not superhuman, as we've seen very clearly. Guys got to eat, guys got to rest, they have to consolidate and reorganize, even the bad guys. But if I look up here in the northeast part of the country, I just want to mention real quick, the Ukrainians did make an effective counteroffensive, which is one of the first counteroffensives we've seen in this war, punching back toward the Russian border. So if the Russians are on enough of their heels in some places, might we see an opportunity for the Ukrainians
Hey, Pete,
to take
if
some
that
land
place
back as well?
is not so safe, the city where you saying people could from Mariupol could go to, I'm not Zaporizhzhia, is that right? Why was that chosen? I mean, I don't understand.
Well, it's a good question. I don't have the answer to that. I'm not going to stand up here and pretend like I do. Major thoroughfares, I mean, where are you going to retreat? If you live in New York and you're trying to get to Philadelphia, you're probably using the New Jersey Turnpike. I don't know, and in the Garden State Parkway, that could be the same scenario. Up in the north, what is there? Who knows? And I bet a lot of people will be making decisions for themselves at this point.
Yeah, they may go, I don't want to go there.
I don't want to go in that direction. Who do I know where?
We'll find out the answer to some of those questions in just a moment. Right now, Secretary of State Antony Blinken condemning Russia on his trip overseas this morning.
Our next guest recently met with the secretary, calling for America to recognize Putin's war crimes. Daria Kolenyuk is the executive director of Anti-Corruption Action Center in Kiev, and Hannah Hoop is the former chair of Foreign Affairs Committee in Ukraine's parliament. And they both join us now. Thank you for joining us this morning. Hannah, you met with Secretary Blinken. What did you take away from that meeting?
I do believe that after this meeting, Secretary Blinken finally will deliver the military assistance that U.S. is obliged to support Ukraine according to the security guarantees when we give up with the third largest nuclear power plant. Yesterday, we showed the pictures of dying children. Now, because what Putin is doing in Ukraine, this is the genocide. You know, I started this morning from receiving call from my friend. Unfortunately, 2 newborn kids, their parents were killed. And now they are seeking who could take them. And actually, I was talking to my husband that maybe we should take these 2 newborn kids because they are without parents. And this is what we try to deliver to State Secretary Blinken, that U.S. promised us to support. It's about dignity. It's about humanity. We don't understand why the embargo on Russian oil took so long. Why? There is no fighter jets. Okay, there is no protection of sky. So this is really, we don't understand why there is so slow position. Why Russian oligarchs and their kids, they are in US, in UK, when Ukrainian children are being bombed, are being killed by rockets. So look, this is something what we are asking American people, American Congress, please provide military assistance. Please protect our sky, because it's Mariupol you mentioned. You know that Russians deny this green corridor, that humanitarian catastrophe within last 6 days, people without food, without water. So, and actually nuclear power plants. So I think there are instruments that U.S. as a leader of democracy. So if you are really pretend to be leader, because now Ukrainian army, Ukrainian armed forces, we are with our courage, with our bravery, so actually with the spirit of victory, please, we ask you, join our fight, because this is about stopping authoritarian regime, stopping this new Hitler, new Stalin, this new fascist Nazis regime which Putin is present.
Daria, you also met with the secretary. Did you feel like he was receptive to what you were saying he should do to declare this a war crime? Do you feel like he's doing enough? How did he receive your information?
He was listening, but it was clear that the U.S. is afraid to contradict Russia. And we explained to Blinken that there is cost for non-action, that non-action, non-giving Ukraine air defense system to protect our sky from Russian bombs could cause much bigger devastation than actually contradicting Russia. That any second, Russian missile can hit one of 5 Ukrainian nuclear power plants, and you will not be able to put a sarcophagus over entire Ukraine. And I told to Secretary Blinken that last 10 years I spent on building rule of law in Ukraine. I am running Anti-Corruption Action Center organization in Ukraine. We built anti-corruption infrastructure. We became successful and we received help from America. But Ukraine is now being executed by Russia for deciding to be free and for believing in democracy and rule of law. And now, when we are begging America to give us protection of our skies, to prevent deaths of millions of civilians, we are receiving no. We are afraid. We are afraid of big war. Guys, we in Ukraine don't afraid of big war. We will fight till the very end. But if millions of people, including children, will be killed, it will be on the responsibility of the leadership of NATO member states and especially on the leadership of the United States.
And this comparison that Ukraine, that US is not ready to protect because the failure in Afghanistan, please do not compare, because Ukrainian president, he is in Kiev. Ukrainian mayor of the capital, Klitschko, world-known boxman, he is in Kiev, the fifth president. So everybody is in Kiev. So actually we are believing and we are winning. The blitzkrieg of Putin failed. So actually, if Ukraine received the same amount of support, look, millions, trillions of dollars, what you invested in Afghanistan, and our people are now in Ukraine, territorial defense, courage women, which are producing Molotov cocktails. So we will win. And actually now it's a time to join to our future victory, because it's how to stop terror, how to stop current Nazis. So this is why we were trying to explain Secretary Blinken, please help us.
Well, your pleas are being heard. Many Americans agree with you. Others are worried that that could escalate into a nuclear war or a third world war. And there are many things that people are considering. But your pleas are heard. And your passion is definitely, and the fight in the Ukrainian people is very admirable. Thank you both for joining us this morning. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for American people who are standing up and asking their government to act. Inaction will kill more.
Talk to me about what you believe Ukrainians can do to protract this.
Well, I think they're already doing it, Pete. I mean, they are fighting a conventional fight, as you were talking about this morning, but also you're seeing this unconventional fight start to happen where partisans, where civilians are taking up arms. And the fact that Putin has extended his lines so long, his morale of his troops is so low, and it's an unpopular will at home, he's going to have to occupy these cities at some point, and that's when the people can start to rise up in a resistance. And I think that's where he's really going to meet hard times.
Scott, you just real quick before we go to Joey, you think eventually Vladimir Putin would have to attempt to hold these city centers? And because that would be a massive task that we're all familiar with how difficult it is.
Yeah, I don't believe you can do this kind of a breach into a country and not have to hold or occupy. And that's where his Achilles heel is going to come in. The question is, what will the United States do about it? I mean, our relationship with our partners is not exactly stellar these days.
That's as we witnessed in Afghanistan and elsewhere. Joey, if this goes into, let's say, not 10 days, but 10 weeks, and this moves forward, how consequential could an insurgency be?
Well, first of all, you said the appropriate word, which is if. It's a big if. We don't know what happens tomorrow, much less what happens a month from now. Scott's absolutely correct, though. If you go in and you start bombing apartment buildings and some of the other atrocities we hear about, we have no way to substantiate. I'm not going to repeat them right now, but just Russians mistreating Ukrainians in a terrible way. You create the will to fight for as long as you're there. Vladimir Putin's original stated goal was to replace the government, not take over Ukraine. Who knows what's on the menu today as we sit here and this war is dragging in a way that I don't think he predicted. But I'll make a distinction, though. I think more the IRA and less the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. You have groups of people here that are neighbors. You have groups of people that speak the same language in some places, speak similar languages in other places, share cultures in some ways. The IRA operated in a way that the fight didn't just stay where they were. And so if Moscow occupies Ukraine, the fight's going to go to Moscow. I mean, we talk about a sophisticated insurgency, when we talk about sabotage and IEDs and things of that nature, there's no reason why that won't spill over into Vladimir Putin's country itself. And when I say there's no reason, I say that having not been there, not understanding the full height of security, but it becomes an infiltrated fight, and especially when they share a border.
Scott, what's a worst case scenario here in your mind? I mean, Joey described something that would be a serious escalation if it were to, something were to happen in Moscow as well. How would things spiral in the wrong direction in your mind?
Well, I mean, you have an unpredictable totalitarian leader. So, I mean, with his hands on, nuclear weapons. So that, I think that one is first and foremost in my mind, that it could spiral in a lot of directions that way. But what I worry about is this kind of tepid response that we're displaying kind of at the political level and even at some of our military senior officer levels. I mean, it seems to me that we are ignoring the power of a resistance. And we've done this multiple times now, the power of a partner nation to stand up and make a stand, and our ability to build those relationships that we've done over the last 10 years with our special forces. The question is, how will we leverage that going forward? To me, that's a worst case scenario. If we abandon these relationships once again, our place in the world as a leader is really going to continue to deteriorate, and we're going to put our troops at more risk.
We were talking about javelins and stingers, Joey, and Scott, you can chime in on this as well. How effective are they, in your minds, in your experience, in the hands with less trained civilians? Should we get more advanced weaponry into the hands of civilians, Joey?
They're pretty effective. I mean, we saw what the Mujahideen was able to do with them. It's different terrain, different circumstance, but they can be very effective. I don't know if anybody's going to fire these without any type of training at all. I think what it comes down to is opportunity to use them. And we talk about this 40-mile convoy, and people tweet, hey, we've got these ground-to-ground javelins. Why don't they just run out there and use them? It's like, well, a 40-mile convoy isn't going to sit there without a security perimeter. And when you're outnumbered, outmanned, and outweaponed, you don't have the opportunity to lose a 12-man team to go out and shoot javelins at a convoy that you hope you might be able to use a plane against. And so will they eventually be very useful and effective in an insurgency situation? Absolutely. Right now, today, I think the Ukrainians are still holding on to the idea they'll get air support and they'll get conventional military support.
Scott, real quick, last word.
Yeah, I would just say that, when it comes, there's nothing more powerful than an inspired and motivated partisan fighting for their freedom. And whether that's with a Molotov cocktail or a javelin, you're going to be in for a long, hard fight if that's what you're up against. And that's what Putin has chose to be up against. And I hope that the United States can jump in there, too, and help where we can.
You've done that for a living, Scott Mann, so appreciate your words. Scott and Joey, thanks a lot.
So to the 5 o'clock hour here on the East Coast, I'm Kevin Cork in Washington. Russia is said to be weighing the risks of launching cyber attacks against the West. We're now joined by the CEO of Cyber Sheath, Eric Noonan. Eric, listen, I can tell you this, and I'm sure you have heard this. That is an absolutely frightening prospect, especially given how connected we are, not just domestically, but globally. What are the chances that that is something that the Kremlin is strongly considering?
Well, Kevin, I'd have to say the chances are pretty high, given that really everybody of consequence and in a position to know in the United States government has warned us that these attacks are potential and potentially likely. And so we have the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, CISA, FBI issuing bulletins and warnings for businesses large and small to be ready for these kinds of attacks. So I think that there's a very high likelihood that we could see this kind of activity. And certainly we've seen it in the past from Russia, China, and other nation states. But clearly in this case, the top concern is an attack from Russia.
Before I get into what measures we might be able to take as a nation to not only combat that anytime there's malign behavior, and I think my friends in the IC would tell me that, trust me, we're not sitting on our hands on this, but I think from a consumer's perspective first, Eric, there are a lot of people are wondering how might that impact me, or what, if anything, should I be considering in the eventuality that this is something that befalls our country?
Well, I think that's a key word. I think it is an eventuality at some point. And so when I think of kind of everyday Americans and the potential impacts for them, and we think of the critical infrastructure, and we hear it a lot of times, but to try and put some kind of context to what is critical infrastructure and how might it affect us, and we think of our water supply, our electrical grid, our financial services system, and so in a nutshell, it becomes everything. It all becomes critical because, as you say, Kevin, we are so digitally connected now. So the vulnerability really is tremendous and wide-reaching.
What would you recommend to a friend or family member in preparation for what is likely to come?
Well, certainly there's, the potential for everyday Americans to think, what can I do kind of in response to some of these alerts? But really, where our focus should be is what can businesses do, large and small, because that's ultimately the target from a disruptive perspective relative to critical infrastructure. So for businesses, really, they should follow the regulatory requirements that are largely in place today. And so these recommendations from FBI and CISA aren't new. 7 years ago, President Obama made a recommendation, 7 years ago this past January, for data breach reporting and mandatory information sharing. 7 years later, we're still thinking about making that law. And so it still hasn't happened. And so what I would urge is for the long term, collectively, for both political parties who seem to have bipartisan support for these issues, to get teeth behind the laws that in some cases already exist around data breach reporting, information sharing, and mandatory cybersecurity minimums for federal contractors. Those are the things that we can do that will have a very meaningful impact in being able to defend everyday Americans against these attacks.
Unfair to give you such a short time to answer this question, but in the last 15 seconds I have, are you confident that the U.S. and our infrastructure will be able to combat what is yet to come?
I'm very confident that we have the agencies looking at the problem in the right way, sharing the information with the right parts of the critical infrastructure who need the information and are prepared to act.
Eric Noonan joining us as always. We appreciate your time and especially your expertise. We obviously would love to have more conversations with you in the not too distant future, especially as things unfold. Thank you, Eric. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Kevin.
And we welcome back Anita Vogel. Listen, Anita, this has been, at least for you and for me, an enlightening time here on the air this morning. And I was struck by what we saw from some of the pictures in Ukraine, and obviously Lawrence reporting, and Jonathan as well. Your thoughts?
Yeah, exactly. Lauren's reporting from the border in Poland, where those refugees are being received with open arms and so many supplies and love and warmth. That was really encouraging to see, amidst all the despair that we're seeing coming from Ukraine.
Yeah, and some of the pictures, I mean, we have had such great luck in getting strong pictures, and obviously we want to bring that to the folks at home because that's the most important thing. For Anita Vogel, I'm Kevin Corke. We thank you for watching this special coverage here on Fox News Channel as we continue to watch the history unfold before our very eyes. More